government. And of course, when the Congress saw this Constitution, they rejected it out of hand. And they sent another Constitution. I mean, they told Kansas, you have to send a Constitution that we can accept, but the one you've sent to us, we just cannot accept. All right. Political parties were shifting. There was a new party that formed called the Know Nothings. It was like a lodge, a secret society, because every time you ask them, what are you doing at your meetings? I know nothing. What do you do? What do you believe? I know nothing. What we do know about the Know Nothings, so they were sometimes called the American Party. They were against immigration. And folk, again, not to be offensive, but I mean, I feel like I should not sweep this under the rug. They were strongly anti-Catholic. And just like racism is an ugly part of American history, so also is an anti-Catholic sentiment. That's also a part of American history also. And I feel like, I don't want to overemphasize it, but I must mention it. Anyway, the Know Nothings were strongly anti-Catholic. Later on, when the Ku Klux Klan was formed, they also were anti-Catholic. But what was happening was a whole lot of foreigners were coming in from Ireland in particular, and Germany. And a lot of the Germans who came were Catholic. A lot of the Irish, almost all the Irish who came in were Catholic. And a lot of persons said, we don't want them because eventually the Catholics will outnumber the Protestants and they'll take over. I mean, this was the fear they had throughout this period of time. The Know Nothings did put up former President Fillmore for president. He carried only the state of Maryland. But Fillmore believed he could win because he believed that his presence on a ticket would divide the election to where nobody would get a majority. Then he believed that he could win in the House of Representatives. He did not win again. But anyway, the Democrat Party in the meantime became more and more of a Southern party. But they got that way by avoiding, a lot of time trying to avoid the question of Southerners. Now a new party began to form, made up mostly of Whigs. This party is the Republican Party, the same party of today. Now this takes us up to the election of 1856, where the Republicans put up a candidate for the first time. The first candidate they put up was Fremont. And the popular slogan was free soil, free men, free speech, Fremont. Fremont had gotten a name for himself because he went out west and discovered a whole lot of trails. He was called the Pathfinder. But if you look at it, he had problems, incompetence mainly. He was unsuccessful at most of what he attempted. He just could not see things straight. But anyway, he had made a name for himself. But anyway, he was the first candidate the Republicans put up. A lot of Southerners opposed him. Fremont ran on an anti-slave ticket. A lot of Southerners opposed him, and one man said Fremont's government would be a hostile government if Fremont were to be elected.
So he was a Republican and anti-slave?
He was a Republican. The Republican Party started off as an anti-slave party. Yeah, unlike the Democrats became more and more pro-slave, and Republicans. Now, another thing too about the Republican Party, your book mentions this. Initially, it started out mostly as the party of the rich, and that's looked on that way to this day. Now, again, I'm not supposed to promote parties in politics here, but I'm just stating a fact here. The Republican Party is often looked on in a lot of circles, all down through from the time it was formed to this present day, as being the party of the rich and the wealthy, and the Democrat being the party of the common man. Now, again, each of you can make up your mind for yourself how much of that you believe, how much of it take. And again, I don't want to promote one party over another in here, but I mean, I guess it's okay to say the perception that a lot of people have. From the beginning, a lot of your Republicans were the well-off and well-to-do, but they opposed slavery. And a lot of the initial Republicans were people who came from the old Whig Party. Well, the election of 1856 was won by President James Buchanan against Fremont. James Buchanan is unique in that he's the only president in history who never married. The only bachelor. Now, he got to be president largely because, again, not because he was prominent, but because during the turmoil in Kansas, where the people of Kansas started shooting each other, called Bleeding Kansas, during the turmoil, Buchanan was out of the country, and also he was a dough-face like the man before him. The Democrats passed over Pierce, and then passed over Douglas, because Pierce had been an ineffective leader anyway. Passed over Douglas because Douglas was too controversial. The man who really won chose a dark horse candidate, a man who was relatively unknown, but a man who they thought could win. He was a northern man with southern sympathies, and he'd been out of the country during much of the turmoil that went on under Franklin Pierce. Oh yeah, your book mentions that Fremont had a really active wife who rallied a whole lot of women around the party and did a lot to help her husband. The election was close. The Republicans, though, said this is a glorious defeat, and they were actually happy. They said, okay, we lost, but we made a really strong showing for the election. We're a new party, and they believed that the next election would go their way. And in fact, for the next 50 years, most of the elections were to go their way. The Republican Party did not try to be conciliatory. They were against everything the South stood for. The South wanted a low tariff. The Republicans wanted a high tariff. The South wanted slavery. The Republicans were against it. The Republicans wanted banks. The South generally were against them. Whatever the Southern people were for, so the Republicans did not try to compromise. This was why, when the country elected its first Republican president, 11 Southern states left the Union. All right. Now, in the case of Kansas, the trouble with Kansas had begun during the administration of Franklin Pierce, but it really continued to boil over during the time of James Buchanan. Kansas was supposed to be able to decide for itself whether it would be slave or free. So both sides got together, each side, and armed themselves for a civil war. They held an election in Kansas. The pro-slavery people won, but fighting broke out. It was at this point that John Brown killed 5 men at Pottawatomie Creek. Guerrilla warfare engulfed. The people would hide behind trees or behind rocks or behind buildings and shoot at their opponents and then run. Guerrilla type tactics. And it led to a whole lot of lawlessness in Kansas, and the government was paralyzed, unable to do anything about it. In the Senate, a senator named Charles Sumner. We're going to hear about him later. Charles Sumner was sitting at his desk at the Senate one day when into his office came Preston Brooks of Southern. Now, Charles Sumner was a Northerner against slavery. Preston Brooks came and started beating Sumner with a cane. It took the seriously injured Sumner 3 years to recover. And he recovered enough to take his seat back in the Senate, but he was seriously injured. But he later became a prominent senator again during the days of Andrew Johnson. But anyway, Charles Sumner developed a real hatred for the Southerners that he was to hold the rest of his life. But also it stirred up trouble between North and South more because it was a case of a Southerner attacking a Northerner. And So basically the Civil War, I mean, officially it started in 1861, but it actually was going on in Kansas and a little bit in Washington, the area around Washington, a few years before then. Now, okay, now we come to one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has ever made. Dred Scott. Here's the story of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave, black man. Lived, he had started out in Missouri, but his master moved him to Minnesota, which was not yet a state. But Minnesota was a territory that was, where slavery was illegal. Then his master moved him to Illinois, which was a state where the slavery was also illegal. Now, a bunch of men got together, a bunch of lawyers. Now, Dred Scott could not sue himself, he was too poor. But a bunch of lawyers sued on his behalf, saying that because Dred Scott had resided in a free territory and a free state, he was therefore a free man and should have been freed before he moved to either Minnesota or Illinois. The case worked its way up through the courts and wound up all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was led by a Southerner, Chief Justice named Taney. Now, the title of Chief Justice is really symbolic. I mean, there's always been a Chief Justice, but the Chief Justice has no more authority than the other court members. I mean, his vote only counts one time, and the other members of the court are not obligated to vote his way. But Taney wrote the opinion for the majority. The Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. The Supreme Court initially ruled that Dred Scott was not a free man because residence in a free territory did not make a slave free. If the court had stopped there, maybe things could have worked out. Instead, the court decided to make what they hoped to be a final decision that would settle all the issue of slavery. They said that Congress had no right to divide the nation up half slave and half free. Therefore, all the compromises that had been worked up were unconstitutional. They overturned all the hard work compromises that Henry Clay had worked out. Essentially, what they said was, okay, so if a Pennsylvania factory owner decided he wanted to go find cheap labor, he could take a train down to Maryland, buy slaves in Maryland, take them back to his factory and work his factory with slaves. And there was nothing anyone in Pennsylvania could do about it. Now, granted, Pennsylvania still outlawed slave trade, but if a slave owner moved to Pennsylvania, he could take his slaves with him. Or, I mean, any man in Pennsylvania could go to Maryland, buy a slave, and hold that slave. Now, this was because of a clause in the Constitution, folks, that's still there, that any important document issued as valid in one state must be recognized as valid in another state. In other words, if I hold a marriage license from Georgia, well, if I move to Ohio, that marriage license is considered valid in Ohio because it was issued by the state of Georgia. The driver's license I hold is good for the state of Ohio, also, or Kentucky. Now, of course, if I move, I have to get a license now. If I actually take up residence in another state, I have to get a license in their state. Now, don't think that because you have a Georgia license that you can live in another state indefinitely, but you can get a driver's license in another state if you actually move and take up residence there. But a Georgia-issued driver's license is good in all 50 states. But see, basically the Supreme Court was saying that because a man is a slave in one state, his status as a slave has to be recognized as legal and binding in every state in the Union. On this issue, the court was on somewhat firm ground. But what they did was they rendered any chance of future discussion on the matter or any chance of future compromise impossible. In other words, slavery was the law of the land, it was the permanent law of the land, and it could exist anywhere, and Congress had no right to step in anywhere and stop it. And again, the way the Constitution was worded at the time, they were right. A lot of people, in view of what happened afterwards, a lot of persons have said that this is the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made. And by so doing, the Supreme Court needlessly shot themselves in the foot. Had a young lady, I mean, I don't know where most of you are from, but and I generally don't ask. Occasionally I'll ask, but usually I don't. I had a young lady from Russia one time in one of my classes, and she said to me, there has to be somebody who makes, someone in any society, in any government who makes a final decision. I said, no, that's not what we do in a democracy. But we do in our democracy. The Supreme Court has the final say-so on every issue that splits us up, that divides us. And folk, I want to reiterate, that is not democracy. To overturn this bad decision, it took the lives of more than 600,000 young men and a 4-year-long bloody civil war. Dred Scott. Now, I've had more than one student do a paper on this. Dred Scott eventually got his freedom. But not because of the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice Taney, it looks like that name is pronounced Taney, but it's actually spelled T-A-N-E-Y, but it's Taney. I'm not going to write his name down. I mean, just simply, I don't care if you learn his name or not. Here's what Justice Taney said, though. He said I'm going to call them blacks because I'm not going to use the word he used, but the black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect, unquote. Taney hated Republicans. He hated the idea of racial equality. The decision made the Republicans explode in outrage. And even in the North, slaves the former slaves were fearful, even the people who got to the North. Your Southern Democrats cheered the decision as being the best thing news they'd heard from Washington in a long time. It actually was to prove to be really, really bad news in the long run. But as a result of this decision, the Republican Party gained strength. Dred Scott did not enjoy his freedom long. When his owner died, the owner's son owned him, but the owner's son freed him. Dred Scott unfortunately died shortly after getting his freedom.
How did he die?
I really don't know. Possibly of old age. I don't know.
Unknown cause.
A lot of African people who survived the trip from Africa have problems to this day with hardening of the arteries, high blood pressure, heart attack, and stroke. And a lot of people believe it's because of something that they had that helped them survive. The very thing that helped them survive the long voyage across the Atlantic is a thing that kills them when they get to a certain age. Yes?
I have a speculation. Because Dred Scott was such an issue,
Yeah.
like what if like Southern white people like just went out and tried to kill Dred Scott just because the principle of it all?
That has never been said by anyone I've ever heard. I mean, okay, I mean, if you, no, I've never heard of that. I don't know if anything. It might have happened now, but it could have. But keep in mind, travel was a lot slower than it is now. Now, I mean, we have a case going on right now where something happened in Detroit, Michigan that involved Atlanta parents, and said Atlanta parents said, we're going to go to Detroit, or maybe Chicago, we're going to settle this. But and again, they could get in their car and be in Detroit before the day's out. Yes.
Going back to Sumner, and I guess
Charles Sumner.
Charles Sumner, and
Yeah.
people like that's not liking him, and you're saying how like the Republican Party was predominantly like the haves.
The haves, yes.
I know I've read somewhere and seen documentation that, and I think I mentioned this a couple of classes ago, that the blacks eventually were Republicans. That they were the first. It was as like they were prominent Republicans. Like one of the first senators was a Republican. So
Yeah,
them switching parties, it's bewildering to a lot of.
Well, there was a movie put out called Hillary in 2016 that some of you might have seen that dealt with that very issue that originally. Well, I remember when I was 16 years old, I was listening to the radio and Jackie Robinson was on the radio. Jackie Robinson was now a retired baseball player. He said, "Oh, I'm Republican." Barry Goldwater was running for president, so actually I was probably 7. And he said, "Oh, I'm Republican. I've always been. I will always be Republican." But they switched because the Democratic Party began to promise some handouts.
Really, yeah. Yeah. 'Cause
Again, if any of you don't like what I'm saying, your input is welcome.
Yeah, no, it's true.
What's that?
It's true.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
yeah, it's better that you hear it from a black person rather than hear it from me. All right. Okay. But anyway, yes, the blacks initially were highly, strongly Republican. But again, the Republican Party appeared to be the party of the rich. All right, this brings us up to what your book calls the Prairie Republican, not just a book, a lot of people, of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a lawyer. He started out very poor and got to be up in the upper 5% of the country in wealth by this time. But in 1858, he ran for Senate against his former friend Douglas. Now, so a few years back, I guess 10 years ago, the city of Atlanta had a debate. I mean, they featured Lincoln and Douglas, and they had a man there who was tall and looked like Lincoln, and another man who was short and somewhat looked like Douglas, and these two men reenacted the debates. And my wife and I went to see them, and I got a few video clips of them, which I'm not going to bother to show now. But anyway, the Lincoln and Douglas engaged in debate. Now, here's the thing you have to understand about this Illinois race. In those days, senators were not chosen by popular vote. Senators were chosen by the state legislatures. This was a change in the early 1900s as a result of, I believe, the 16th Amendment. Maybe it was 17th. I believe it's 16th, though. As a result of one of the amendments, the senators are now chosen by popular vote. So when Lincoln was running against Douglas, he tried to appeal to the state senators. Well, Douglas believed he was a shoo-in to win easily because he'd been winning several senatorial races, and Douglas still wanted to become president of the United States. So in 1858, this was a mid-year election now, not the real election of 1860, but this was a mid-year election. Now, folk in a foot race, we're in a race with bicycle race, or even a rowboat race, the man or woman who's in front has one disadvantage. They can't see the other contestants. I had a student at one time, well, why can't they see the other contestants? Anybody know why?
They're running their own race.
They're winning the race. That means the other contestants are behind them, and any champion runner knows you can't turn around without slowing yourself down. Now, when I cross the finish line, that's okay. I mean, and I recall watching a movie about Secretariat, and when Secretariat crossed the finish line, his rider had to turn way back to see who the next horse was 30 paces behind him. 30 lengths behind him, not pace, 30 lengths. But he had to turn way back. But during the time that the race was going on, he had no idea where the other contestants were. They were pretty far back. But anyway, it's all right. Lincoln had this one advantage over Douglas, and that Douglas was the front runner, and it looked like Douglas was going to win. Douglas did win. But Douglas would go and make a speech. When the speech was over, before the crowd had time to leave and Douglas was pulling out, Lincoln would step up and he would give another speech. This went on for about a few episodes. But Lincoln's speeches began to be taken up by the papers, and the press began to publish what Lincoln said. And finally someone said, "Oh, Mr. Douglas, why don't you just stay around and the two of you get together?" So the two of them got together and they started debating each other. The high point of the debate was when Abraham Lincoln asked Mr. Douglas if slavery could be legally excluded from a territory before that territory formed a state constitution. Douglas was trapped. If he answered one way, he'd be going against the Supreme Court decision of the year before, in 1857. If he answered another way, he'd be going against his own doctrine of popular sovereignty. So he put forth a new doctrine. He said slavery cannot exist anywhere where it is not wanted. It's Freeport. This happened at Freeport, Illinois. It was called his Freeport Doctrine, which actually hurt him because the Democratic Party rejected the doctrine. But Lincoln insisted, he said, the nation cannot endure half slave and half free. Here he quoted Jesus. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He said, I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will someday cease to be divided. It will cease to be half slave and half free. Now, all right now, folk, if you look closely at the issue, I mean, I have to tell you this. If you judge Abraham Lincoln by 2019 standards, Lincoln was a racist. He did not believe that the white man and black man could ever get along together, so his solution was to transport all the blacks either to Costa Rica or to Cuba or back to Africa.
I wonder if it do with the Martin Luther King sort of reference, like how he made them equal.
Lincoln did not believe that they would ever be equal. No, Martin Luther King was to come more than 100 years later. 100 years later. Anyway, again, but folk, what I want to try to point out that was made to us, you have to try to understand these men and judge them by the standards of their own time. If you judge them again by our standards, they're going to look not like their ideal. And of course, something else I've learned. As a young man, I had my heroes, and yes, Lincoln was one of my heroes. But as you get older, you start learning that each of these heroes, you might say, have toes of clay. They have some serious weakness about them. I did not know till I was almost 50 years old, for instance, that Martin Luther had called for the extermination of Jewish leaders. And he's been blamed for the Holocaust. I mean, folk, again, if you want to look at this, it's in the records. For those of you, I mean, and I started to say something to a man at Lockheed one time. You're talking about a man I admire greatly, so I just closed my mouth. Yes, he's a man you admire greatly, but he had some serious problems. In fact, some of my students loaned me a DVD about Martin Luther that was made by Catholics, and they were saying Martin Luther was our boy and Martin Luther was right, but when he was wrong, he could be very, very wrong. But the point I'm making, folk, is everybody has some kind of serious flaw about him that makes you, after a while, realize that you cannot put your trust in humans indefinitely. You'll sooner or later find out something about them that you did not like. Anyway, Lincoln's speeches were again put in the newspapers, and eventually this thrust Lincoln into the spotlight. But when the final vote was taken, the state legislature voted on Douglas by 8 votes against Lincoln. The legislature voted against him. And Lincoln went away very disappointed. Lincoln believed his political career was over. Douglas believed that he was on his way now to becoming president of the United States. Both men were wrong. In a few years, Douglas was to say, I'm a failure. And Lincoln was to become president. But because of the Freeport Doctrine, Southerners whom Douglas was trying to get on his side became very, very much against him, against Douglas. Well, this takes us up to the election of 1860. Well, not quite. John Brown made a raid on Harper's Ferry this time. I've already mentioned that, so I guess it does take us up to 1860. Essentially, in the election of 1860, the Democrats met. They chose a candidate, but the Southern delegates walked out of the convention and said, no, we're not going to have this candidate. We're going to choose somebody else. So they chose a different. So the Northerners chose Douglas, Northern Democrats. The Southern Democrats chose another man. Well, in order to try to unite the party, the Democrats then chose a third man. So now you had 3 Democrats because the other 2 wouldn't quit. Douglas and Breckinridge wouldn't quit. So you had Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell, 3 Democrats running. The Republicans finally chose Abraham Lincoln. But Lincoln was elected by the convention, after a few mishaps that went in his favor, number one, the printing press where the ballots were printed up broke down, and they had to wait a whole day to get the ballots printed up. And during that time, Lincoln supporters were going around rallying for him. If that printing press had not broken down, perhaps Lincoln might never have gotten the nomination and never been president, because there were some pretty strong Republicans running, but the West was solidly behind Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln